Hi, welcome back to another episode of What's Going On.
A Social Studies Network podcast. I'm Maeve.
And I'm Mary, and this is a podcast where we talk about different topics in the social studies field.
Today we're talking about President Trump's plans for education in his second term.
Right, so let's get into it.
So, back at the beginning of November, President Trump was reelected for his second term of office as the President of the United States. And so, as we've seen, this means a lot of different things. Today we're kind of looking at it from an educational standpoint and what this might mean for social studies education. I was just curious, Mary, how are you feeling?
Well, honestly, I'm feeling a little nervous, right?
Mm-hmm.
A lot of the things that I value in education have been kind of threatened in a way by the plans that Trump might enact in his coming term, right?
Mm-hmm.
Things like discussing inclusivity or just access to education for most students, I feel that is important, and we don't know how that's going to look like in the coming years.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. I'm definitely recognizing a lot of the same emotions I'm feeling in what you just said. And as we'll discuss a little bit, a lot of what has been said and what Trump has planned to do is a bit vague. So it's easy to let the mind wander into what could happen and what's going to happen without a very concrete plan as of yet. We're going to talk a little bit about like what he has said. Overall, I'm definitely feeling that nervousness too, just to discuss this topic. It's a tricky topic in a way. Going back to what we talked about last week, it makes me a little uncomfortable. And as much as I want to follow our advice from last week to lean into the discomfort, that doesn't make me any less nervous.
Yeah. That's totally understandable, right? As we were researching, I was also feeling that discomfort. Like, what do we say? What can we say?
Mm-hmm.
And especially if you're in the classroom, you might be asking these questions too. What do we want to say to our students? What is helpful? And in a way, like, just what won't get us in trouble?
Especially as we've been seeing, and we will see and discuss how Trump views teachers and what his plans are for teachers.
Something that we see in many of Trump's stances and many Republican stances as well is that we want to make teaching more localized, right? Moving education away from being kind of like a federal concern with regulations and stuff back to the states and the towns, the teachers, and the parents.
So we can look back at his first term and see what he did to put local governments in charge of teaching, how he cut funding for certain education programs, and made an attempt to dismantle the Department of Education, which is something that's currently being talked about, and was part of his campaign plan to dismantle the Department of Education.
So as I was kind of hinting at before, one of the things that Trump wants to do is kind of move away the power that the federal government has over education back to the states, right? And that is kind of built off of the perception that the Department of Education kind of controls the curriculum and what is being taught, especially things that are uncomfortable or maybe unfavorable to some people, right? But that's not necessarily what the Department of Education does.
I think that's one of the most interesting myths about the Department of Education, that many people believe it's like trying to control the curriculum and like it's all about critical race theory and indoctrinating children, when it's not.
Or more specifically, on top of like funding and kind of research, the things that it does is protect civil rights for students especially, right?
Part of his plan is to shut down the Department of Education, like he tried to during his first term, in a way that he tried to combine multiple departments, including the Department of Education, in a way to limit funding or limit spending. And that was unsuccessful in his first term, so we'll see if he is successful this time or not.
Right, just to expand on what you said, in his last term, he did say he was going to combine different departments to kind of dissolve the Department of Education, but that didn't gain much traction, right? And it kind of fell apart. This coming term, we don't really know what he's going to try to do because, like you said before too, a lot of his policies are like very vague, right? And we can only kind of speculate how he's going to do it, maybe taking the same approach as he did before or trying something new. He might do something similar to the last term, or he might do something different and something maybe more drastic or more pulled back. I think this is probably one of the biggest worries that teachers and educators have, because it really does impact like all the nation and what education might look like in the future. Shutting down the department has always been kind of a Republican talking point or concern since it was established by President Carter. We've seen this before with President Ronald Reagan, where he did attempt to shut down the department, and it was one of his talking points, as we said. But attempts to do it were unsuccessful because it was shut down by Congress, right? And that's something that we have to keep in mind. Shutting down a department is not just a presidential choice or matter. It also has to go through Congress. Another big topic that often comes up in discussions about education is Common Core, right? And that's something that's more recent, only coming out in 2010, but it still very much impacts, the education of students across the nation. There's also a big misconception that's something that's federally implemented, but no, it's state by state, right? Hold on. Even if not everyone might agree that Common Core addresses what they feel aligns with their values and the standards they think students should get to, we can all kind of see that teachers and parents and people in the community want the students to learn something that is important, substantial, and aligns with their values, right? And that's kind of a concern that teachers might have in this coming term, right? Because a lot of the topics that they might feel is important, especially in social studies, are being restricted or silenced in many ways.
It's especially difficult for the teacher who may feel that parents are starting to butt in onto their curriculum in their classroom to instill their own beliefs, not only on that parent's own child, but every child in the classroom. This is something Trump has discussed in promising a more parentally involved school.
And that kind of enhances the tension that teachers and parents always tend to have, right? The story of a kid coming back, or the story of a kid taking what they learned in the classroom, telling their parent, and then having the parent come back into the classroom, arguing with the teacher or the principal about what was being taught is very common even now. So as parents are given more of a freedom or maybe a voice in the classroom, that might cause conflicts in trying to teach students, right? And because of this tension, we might also see like an increase of parents taking their children away from publicly funded schools into more private schools that align with their values, right?
Exactly. That's something Trump has discussed in his first term and in his campaign for his second term, is this idea for school choice. Such as we saw in his first term, where he redirected $5 billion tax credits to schools that promoted school choice programs.
Universal school choice, by definition, is giving parents and families the opportunity to choose what school they want to send their children to, whether it be public, private, or charter, depending on what they feel is best for their learning environment. That includes giving families like a voucher for them to be able to pay for these private schools. These vouchers are typically funded by the federal government, and some critics have said that kind of funding takes away from public schools, right? Even when we see that many public schools are underfunded.
Yeah, those are some really great points. And I think what a lot of people are asking now is, what does this mean for social studies? And to answer that, we kind of have to circle back to everything we've talked about, especially starting with that things are so vague right now that we don't have a clear answer. However, we are fortunate enough to be able to look back on the past and possibly predict what will happen. We do know right now that there are definitely worries of censorship and even the removal of social studies entirely, because it often does deal with social issues.
Right, and the discussion that we have in social studies fields very often breaks away from narratives that might favor one side or another on political parties, right? And that kind of, in a way, revolutionary discussions might be considered dangerous by some, which is hard because these discussions are not dangerous at all. They help us understand each other and things more in depth. And even if you try to stay neutral and like non-political on certain matters in social studies, you're inevitably going to start talking about things that might make people uncomfortable or things they want to suppress, right? Things like diversity, systematic racism, or just discrimination in general. These are things that are going to come up, right? So as you're teaching, you kind of have to grapple with the wish to address these things and also having to face adversity. So, we have to think about how do we do that.
Exactly. One thing to do is to continue to teach with hope, especially, and to continue a classroom environment where students feel safe and welcome for who they are and any questions they bring in. While it's important to continue to stay informed on the world around you and your students, it's also important to find the things that give them hope.
Right. As we, discuss these difficult things, and as you might discuss difficult things, you also want to provide examples of resistance or things, like you said, that might give you hope. And now especially is a good time to reaffirm your values and really exemplify them in your classroom, right? You also want students to stick to their own values and be comforted by the fact that they have principles, even in the face of such adversity and uncertainty that we're facing right now. Something you might want to do is set expectations about inclusion and acceptance and tolerance, and calling out any negative language or microaggressions you might see in between your students or in the school environment.
Having the courage to point out these things, even when you're scared, is definitely important. It's a great thing to model for your students, to continue to have this mindset that while things are changing around you, be true to who you are.
And then also making time to take care of the students that might not have the courage to speak up and be themselves because of the violence or lack of safety they might feel, right? Especially after elections, those are very tricky times because we see people be more outspoken about their opinions. And after the 2016 election, I think a lot of people had the experience that they saw a lot of bigotry and discrimination and racism be spoken more vocally, right? This year we saw a lot of people on social media kind of repeating the phrase, "Your body, my choice," right? Do you remember that?
I do remember that, and I especially remember younger voices repeating certain hateful phrases such as that one after the election. These phrases can definitely make people feel very unsafe.
Right, especially when these phrases and a lot of topics like this are in circulation on social media, on the news, or even in the classroom. We might have people that may not feel comfortable speaking up because they are the topic of the discussion, right? They don't have the luxury of, or the privilege of being able to distance themselves from these topics. So when rights, autonomy, or just questions of identity and belonging are being debated regarding their life, that's very difficult for them. We want to make sure that they're not feeling afraid and unsafe, especially when you're in a place where you want to learn and you want to expand your knowledge and your connection with the larger world. You don't want to be afraid and attacked and feeling like that larger world is dangerous,
And if you're not one of those people who is feeling the pressure at this moment, what can you do? Well, it's important to continue to provide resources and open spaces for those who are feeling the pressure.
And especially if you see something particularly dramatic or frightening on the news, you might want to take it easy for a few days, right? Tell your students, we know you're dealing with a lot, and we know that you're dealing with a lot emotionally, mentally, and we don't want to add more pressure onto you, right? So let's talk, let's discuss, let's connect and try to move forward and take care of each other, right? So as you're taking care of your students, you also have to make sure to be taking care of yourself, right? This is an important time to self-advocate and practice a lot of self-care for yourself, right? You might decide to spend some time looking up resources and connecting with people that are important to you as you navigate these troubling times.
As we're wrapping up today, we'd like to let you know that we'll be taking a short break. Hopefully we'll be back by the end of January or beginning of early February. But today we talked about former President Trump's plans for education for his second term and how we as social studies teachers can continue moving forward. I'm Maeve.
And I'm Mary, and we wanted to remind you to take care and stay aware.